Hi, I'm Vanessa. I'm a soil scientist and an academic in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment. I'm really interested in what happens in the world below ground. I study the processes and interactions between soils, vegetation and water. I look at how people in society affect soil and water quality when they change the way they manage natural, agricultural and built environments. To do this, I can analyse the soils directly by collecting samples and taking them back into the lab, or by using different instruments to image or see how soil and water characteristics change across the landscape. The best bit about what I do is that I get to apply the results from my projects to real-world applications and work with organisations to develop land and water management policies to improve our environment. Some of the projects that I work on include looking at different aspects of the soils in coastal wetlands to understand the impact of climate change and sea level rise on soil processes and their characteristics. I study how agricultural environments are altered by management practices and how those management practices also affect things like water quality and greenhouse gas emissions. I also work in urban environments which frequently contain contaminated soils and look at different ways to remediate them, or look at understanding how soils change between different areas. This is actually really challenging in our cities because we've built over all of our soils. More recently, I've also started to work with Indigenous archaeologists and Indigenous groups to see how changes in soil properties over time can help us understand how Indigenous people interacted with their landscape.
G'day, I'm Adam. I'm a biogeochemist in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment at Monash. And that means that I study how things cycle through the environment. My particular focus is on water and sediment and how things cycle through water bodies such as lakes and streams and rivers. So for example, I study how nitrogen moves from, for example, fertilizers in agricultural regions down through our rivers and streams and eventually into estuaries, where they're processed usually by the sediments. Or I study how microbes that live on the tiny grains of sand at the beach process carbon and breathe, turning carbon into carbon dioxide. And I study how acidification of the oceans might be starting to dissolve some of our coral reefs up on the coast of Queensland. And the best thing about the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment, and about environmental research in general, is getting out in the field and getting to collect some real samples. So for example, I've been to places like wastewater treatment plants to see what sort of contaminants might be running into our natural environments from these. And I might return these samples to the lab for later analysis to see what's inside of them. Of course, not all environments are contaminated. So I get to go to pristine beaches sometimes, or perhaps to beautiful bushland to see what perhaps the background looks like, what a perfect system looks like. And sometimes I get to spend some really hard days out in the water, taking important samples for really important scientific questions. I also spend time in the lab, sometimes very high-tech labs, like helping to build this 5-ton simulated riverbed, and sometimes less high-tech labs, like this laboratory I set up in a seaside caravan park to study some coastal environments a couple of years ago. The thing about studying Earth, atmosphere, and environment is that it's about all of these things. Most importantly, it's about getting out and getting your hands or perhaps your feet dirty. And I really recommend that you come and study in the School of Earth, Atmosphere, and Environment with us.
Now that you've heard all about what we study, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what our students study. We have a range of student projects at the PhD level, Masters, Honours and undergraduate level. This is Sophia and she's a PhD student. She's working on temperate coastal wetlands and looking at understanding how the interactions between acid generation in these coastal wetlands influences greenhouse gas generation. And she's looking at this under the context of sea level rise scenarios. So much like myself, Sophia has gone out into the field to collect a range of cores and she's brought them back into the lab and subjected them to a range of different inundation scenarios to simulate sea level rise. And she's studying how carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide is produced from these different sea level rise scenarios. Megan is looking at investigating the occurrence and migration of plutonium in the Australian environment. So plutonium is a radioactive element, and it has existed in the Australian environment following a range of nuclear tests. So we got to go across the road to the synchrotron to understand how plutonium interacts with soils in the Australian environment. Lakita looked at the rehabilitation of a waste dump site associated with mine site rehabilitation in the Latrobe Valley, and she looked at using different types of vegetation to assist with this rehabilitation process. We also have a master's project looking at the acidification potential of a range of different coastal wetlands in Western Port Bay. It's a pretty nice place to work out there, and seeing these coastal wetlands makes you think that it is a very interesting place and an interesting outdoor lab to study. And at honours level, we have a series of honours projects which look at different aspects of soils, things like arsenic availability in soils from abandoned gold mine sites. There's a student looking at the effects of Aquasil, which is a soil amendment, and how it interacts with soils in vineyards. And if you're interested in heading overseas, this is Sean, and he was looking at the spatial and temporal changes in soil fertility in Tongatapu in Tonga.
Hi, my name's Kelly. I'm an honours student in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment. I've just collected a whole bunch of sediment cores like this one from this estuary here, and I'm going to look at how the chemistry of nitrogen changes within these cores when burnt bushfire sediment is added to them.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tinsley, and I'm currently doing an honours year with Vanessa looking at arsenic from calcined sands in old mine tailing sites. I started studying in soil science because I liked the variety of stuff that you could learn from just a little bit of soil.
So how about we hear a little bit more detail about some of the other projects we have in this area?
Hi again. This footage comes from a recent field trip. It's part of one of my projects studying the fate of nitrogen in Victoria's estuaries. And the problem is this: when too much nitrogen flows into an estuary, it usually leads to algal blooms. And you might have seen things like this if you've been to Port Phillip Bay or the Gippsland Lakes during problem times in the last few years. Now fortunately, the microbes that live in the muddy sediments below our estuaries are really good at reacting nitrogen. But there are two main types of reaction: a removal reaction that turns the nitrogen into harmless nitrogen gas, but also a recycling reaction, which keeps the nitrogen in the estuary and sometimes makes the problem much worse. And this project is working with groups like the EPA, catchment management authorities, and the Department of Water to understand what conditions make the removal reaction, or the recycling reaction, more dominant. And to do this, we need to visit some beautiful estuaries like this one, and collect some sediment and bring it back to Monash to learn its secrets. Our estuaries are really beautiful, and I hope that this research can help us to understand how they work so that we can keep them that way.
So what do environmental scientists do in their day-to-day job, and where do they work? Environmental scientists work across a range of different organisations in the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. So that means environmental scientists work in government organisations, private companies and non-government organisations. Environmental scientists are also multidisciplinary as well. In terms of their day-to-day tasks, they include developing management plans or policies to minimise the impacts of industrial, agricultural or urban processes on the environment. They also participate in community education and educate the community on environmental issues. They assess, investigate and develop environmental guidelines for regulatory bodies and also undertake environmental research. Environmental scientists also develop sustainable practices and incorporate them into an organisation's operations. In terms of areas of expansion for environmental scientists, expanding areas include the assessment of contaminated land and contaminated water and the remediation of these sites. So environmental scientists look at remediating mine sites such as the coal mines in the Latrobe Valley, industrial areas such as old petrol station sites, of which there are many around Melbourne, and also on infrastructure projects such as the Metro Tunnel and the Westgate Tunnel. But don't just take our word on this. The Australian Government has produced a Jobs Outlook which looks at career prospects and employment prospects for a range of different careers. They describe environmental scientists as scientists who develop, study, implement, and advise on policies and plans for managing and protecting the environment, flora, fauna, and other natural resources. And they also project strong future job growth in this particular area. A quick look online in terms of what companies and where environmental scientists work include those in the private sector or environmental consultancy sector as contaminated land consultants. In the private sector, working as a sustainability manager, so incorporating and developing sustainable practices within an organisation. Local councils also employ sustainability officers and environmental scientists, as do water utilities companies. So South East Water is a water utilities company, and they're also looking for an environmental scientist. And in terms of graduate level positions, there are also a range of graduate programs available for environmental science graduates as well. So how do you become an environmental scientist, and what do you study in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment to become an environmental scientist? Our school offers 3 majors in the Bachelor of Science and associated degrees. We offer the Environmental Science Extended major, the Earth Science major, and the Geographical Science major. If you're really interested in the multidisciplinary aspect of environmental science, then the Environmental Science Extended major is for you. And that extended major has the Environmental Earth Sciences stream. That stream will incorporate aspects of earth and environmental science, biology, and chemistry. If you're really interested in understanding how the world works and want to delve into that in more detail, then the Earth Science major is for you, and within that there's a physical environment stream. The first year sequence looks at an introduction to earth science, atmospheric science, and environmental science. On the other hand, if you love geography and you want to understand how humans and society interacts with the natural environment, then the Geographical Science major is for you. The first year sequence is a combination of a human geography unit and a physical geography unit. These 3 majors will provide you with a foundation to allow you to explore in detail what you're really interested in as you delve into the deeper details of environmental science. We study the processes that occur in soils, sediments, water, and vegetation, and the way that they interact and are affected by change. We look at how humans influence the natural and built environment to find solutions to a range of these environmental challenges. The world really is our lab.